Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start the session now. My name is Anand Darbhe. I'm a managing director in Accenture Strategy and Consulting Practice, and I lead a lot of our work in supply chain planning and fulfillment in India. On behalf of Accenture and Economic Times, I extend a warm welcome to all of you for this event. We appreciate you taking the time out from your busy schedules for this session. Thank you very much. I think we have sort of a great participation across multiple sectors like consumer goods, retail, fashion, life sciences, auto, industrial. And I think we also have a lot of supply chain leaders from all of these organizations joining in. So again, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to a very engaging session with all of you. I think just to set the context, the COVID pandemic has really impacted virtually all the industries that we belong to. I think to different extents, but no industry has been spared. I think, and especially on supply chain, the scale of the impact has been something which most companies did not anticipate. A lot of the supply chains of today were built for efficiency, and many organizations realized that it was very difficult to switch them to a state of responsiveness and agility, at a very short notice in a time of stress, where customer and product segmentations were also changing rapidly. And resilience has therefore emerged as a very key theme at every organization, not only in supply chain, but across all functions. I would say even if you take a step back, even before COVID struck, we had many disruptions from forces like rapidly evolving consumer expectations, new competition coming from outside traditional industry boundaries, digital technologies coming in, and therefore we believe now it's really time for organizations to make fundamental changes to the way they look at supply chain and how supply chain drives growth, becomes more customer centric, becomes more agile, and becomes of competitive differentiation. Let me quickly introduce the panel for today. Akash, if you can go to the next slide, please. So we have a exciting panel of experts to walk us through all the various topics we are planning to discuss. We have Mo Hajibashi, who is a managing director in Accenture Strategy and Consulting based out of our US office. Mo is a part of the global leadership team for supply chain and operations, and he leads the supply chain planning and fulfillment function for us, across the world. We're joined by Vivek Luthra, who is a managing director out of our Singapore office. Vivek leads our supply chain and operations capability for growth markets and drives many large supply chain transformation engagements in the APAC region, and has a good understanding of the challenges and initiatives companies are taking in this part of the world. We've joined by Vineet Ahuja, who is a managing director based out of our Mumbai office. Vineet is an experienced leader, has led and delivered multiple supply chain transformation programs in India across consumer and retail clients, and he'll share his experience of the journeys with one or two clients today. We have Amit Kohli, who is a managing director based out of our Delhi office. Amit has again led multiple supply chain transformation works with our clients in consumer goods. And we have Akash Kedia, who is a senior principal with us and is on the front lines of delivering our work on digital supply chain transformations with multiple clients. We are glad to have Mr. Sunil Kumar, the supply chain planning head for a very large consumer products company and one of our esteemed clients, who would be also joining us and talking about their thinking and their journey of how they've taken some of these initiatives related to the topics that we're speaking on. Let's go to the next slide. What we plan to cover over the next 1 hour or so is really three things. One, how can really companies build a resilient supply chain to compete in the new normal? We'll share our point of view on how we see what are the building blocks and what are the elements of how companies are going about building customer-centric resilient supply chains. We will then bring this to life through multiple examples and case journeys of work we have done with both Indian clients and global clients, bring these concepts to life through real life examples. And finally, we will summarize, all the learnings in terms of what the toolkit we can look at as we shape the resilient supply chain journey, and what are some of the actions that we can take. So really, these three things is what we plan to cover over the next hour, 70 minutes, and we've kept the last 15-20 minutes for questions and discussions with all of you. Feel free to type in your questions to Amit Kohli in the chat window, so that we can collate all of this and pick them up when we reach the Q&A session. So with that, I hand over to Mo to really start off the session and share our global point of view on how what we are seeing on how organizations can build a resilient supply chain. Mo, over to you.
Thank you, Anand. And hello, everyone. It's nice to be joining you here today from my hometown in Texas, in the United States, where I live. And I hope, during these challenging times, we find all of you healthy and safe, and continue to be. That we are living in interesting times, and Anand mentioned, a few things around supply chain. I've been with Accenture 27 years, and as he mentioned, I lead our global planning and fulfillment practice. And a few years ago, when I was leading I also led our products industry supply chain organization for several years. And back when we actually saw a lot of this disruption in supply chain, the concepts around agility and resiliency and responsiveness in supply chain is nothing new. We've been talking about it for years. But there are a few things, over the past, I would say 5-6 years that have really, really disrupted supply chain in a good way, meaning, the technology that is now possible from a architecture standpoint, from the way we actually can have visibility to data and how we can process data to help drive decisions around being agile and responsive in the supply chain, has drastically transformed how we can actually solve for that. And we'll talk a bit about that. In addition to that, obviously the emergence of digital technologies and the device we carry on our hands every day have completely transformed the expectations we as consumers and we as customers actually have for the products and services we buy in the market. And many of that has obviously changed to something that is much more agile in its own right. We're expecting new products and services that are customized to our specific needs on a continuous basis, and it's only getting more customized, those demands. The level of service and the speed of which we're expecting, companies and the products and service that we buy from to actually respond to my needs from a logistics standpoint. When I order something online with direct to consumer has, drastically disrupted that entire channel and transformed the way consumers and the expectations of consumers of how they buy those products, the relationship they have with the brands, and the expectations they have with those brands and products on how they're actually being serviced as completely been disrupted. And all of that has had a massive disruption on how supply chains need to be structured, configured, and how they operate to be able to meet those continuously evolving demands. And on top of that, given the environment, this greater emphasis on sustainability and ethics is a growing trend that all supply chains are needing to solve for as they get much larger, which is evolving into new capabilities, new business models, and frankly, new emerging competitors in the marketplace. So all of this having a pretty significant effect. Akash, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So, we obviously, as good consultants, we're always doing research. We leverage external research. We do our own research. And, all of this customer centricity is really being supported by the data we're seeing. You can see here some of the stats around, the number of executives that we've surveyed that they believe, customer experiences and expectations is what is impacting businesses the most significantly in the coming years. In addition to that, what this is requiring from a supply chain executive standpoint and what supply chain needs to solve for, of creating a more dynamic and flexible supply chain to be able to meet those customer changing needs and products needs, is changing in a significant way. So the good news is, given a lot of the technology advancements that I mentioned before, the data to be able to analyze this and understand where the trends are, what's actually happening in the market is there. The big question is are companies actually established to take advantage of that data and actually adjust their supply chains and capabilities to enable their supply chains to really be able to respond to it? And that's the big challenge that we're hearing as we're out in the marketplace talking to different supply chain executives that they're actually solving for. Akash, if we could move to the next slide, please. So, these times that we're living through over the past, 2 to 3 months clearly has been an accentuation of everything that we've been talking about, of why it is so important to have an agile and responsive supply chain to be able to manage through significant disruptions that are happening in the marketplace. And not only significant disruptions, but the smaller disruptions that are occurring on a continuous basis, whether that's, fluctuating commodity prices, changing transportation costs, different, political and demographic situations that are happening continuously across every region in the globe, and being able to continuously adjust the supply chain based off of the demand that is being impacted by those disruptions, and being able to manage the supply optimized to meet that demand is obviously very, very critical. So, what's happened through this significant disruption that we've all experienced is just accentuating the need for all the concepts we've been talking about in agility and responsiveness. And hence the reason why, we're really reinforcing a lot of our thinking here on customer-centric supply chain, which is part of this broader intelligent supply chain thinking that I referenced earlier. So, Akash, if we can move on to the next slide. The good news is, as I mentioned, through a lot of the evolution of technology and capabilities in the marketplace, the ability to be able to take advantage of those capabilities to actually solve for a new supply chain structure is making the difference. Once again, through some of our research, most of the executives in the industry really do believe that digital platforms will be able to essentially create an environment to be able to share assets and create an ecosystem of capabilities so that you're actually, flexible in being able to leverage capabilities that exist in the marketplace versus building your own. Most executives do understand that the workforce is fundamentally going to have to change because of the automation that's coming in that is driving what used to be many manual activities or transaction-based activities to bot-led technologies and capabilities that are driving those transactional activities or operational activities. Many companies are already or have been investing pretty heavily on taking advantage of these capabilities to actually drive improved visibility into their supply chain and actually improve the collaboration amongst not only the functions within the organization, but then also across enterprises in the value chain itself, which drives increased collaboration across strategic partners in the value chain. A lot of companies right now, it's all about data. How do I take advantage of big data? How am I taking advantage of some of these advanced computing capabilities, machine learning, AI, IoT technologies, as part of their product design activities in many cases that really are transforming how we're actually able to run our supply chain and get visibility and solve for our supply chain. And then also, a large percentage understanding, as I mentioned before, the automation aspects of what's happening, but not just automation and how that's disrupting the workforce, but frankly, the technologies are breaking down what we call the functional barriers that have existed in linear supply chains in the organizational structures of most organizations for years. And we believe that as more capabilities are able to solve cross-functionally through technology, workforce and skill sets are also going to have to adapt to be able to think cross-functionally and solve cross-functionally for the entire organization and for the entire value chain. So Akash, if we could move to the next slide. So, as we always do as good consultants, we come up with frameworks. And this is a level of our framework that we've got as part of our broader intelligent supply chain construct, but really centered around customer-centric supply chain and what capabilities do you actually need to have in place in order to be able to be a customer-centric supply chain. And it really is around these 5 elements. The first point here around innovation, and there are a couple of components within Innovate, which is really tied to establishing a continuous innovation mindset within the organization, not only around how are you innovating the products and services you're taking to market to take advantage of many of these capabilities, but then also how are you continuing to evolve the capabilities within the organization to actually disrupt itself on a continuous basis. And frankly, that is in many times a culture shift for most organizations that they have to actually solve for. This concept around connect and really being able to solve for the integrated value chain. And there are many components that, that really make this up, but it's being able to have, end-to-end visibility of the entire value chain. And what that means, if you think about it, is actually capabilities to be able to tap into the information sets that not only exist within your enterprise organization, but also your collaborative partners, extended value chain organizations and environment, having inventory visibility, having transportation visibility, having manufacturing supply visibility, or even sourcing visibility. To be able to solve for that integrated value chain is critically important, and that's actually a collaboration capability which is requiring tighter information share across partners in the ecosystem. This next point around configuring, and this is a very, very critical one, because most supply chains historically have really been set up as a one-size-fits-all, high volume, low-cost model. To be able to actually, drive cost of products and services down, which may not always be the best solve. And this is where the segmentation principle comes in. I think from a supply chain standpoint, we've been using segmentation principles for many, many years. But now, given the types of information that we have down to the specific combinations of consumer, like individual consumer, product, channel, and geographic combinations, we can actually solve through what we're calling micro segments to be able to set up supply chains that actually solve for the needs of a very specific micro segment, which is the combination of those dimensions that I mentioned. The next point around operate, and this is really thinking about how your organization and how your supply chain capabilities are actually structured to operate. And this is not only moving towards a more service-oriented construct, which is typically very functional today, but driving towards more services for the organization, but then also leveraging, what we call hybrid workforce or even extended ecosystem partnerships to be able to leverage capabilities that exist or have emerged in the marketplace that are providing these services that companies may not have to build on their own. And this is a completely different mindset of, how do you share information? How do you partner with external service providers and external capabilities, perhaps, to be able to actually leverage capabilities at speed for those different micro segments. And then the last point here around optimize, and this is all about taking advantage of the information and frankly the advanced analytical machine learning AI capabilities that exist in the marketplace to be able to drive more optimization and drive more automation into the ecosystem of how the processes are being executed. So these are the components, essentially the building blocks for how we believe companies need to be thinking through their supply chain strategically to actually drive to be more customer centric. Akash, if we can move to the next slide, please. We've touched on this piece, and it's another critical enabling component of being customer centric, and it really ties to an evolving technology architecture that is truly evolving in the marketplace. The days of the old stand up a centralized ERP or standardizing processes and standardizing data infrastructure around the operations globally, that's a baseline stepping stone to this future world that we're now evolving into, where you actually have new architectures evolving on the tops of AWS, Microsoft Azure, Alibaba, Google, which are now providing open infrastructures from a data perspective to be able to plug in connected capabilities and solutions to solve for very specific, advanced functional capabilities to be a part of the broader ecosystem tied in with your transactional ERP. And this is a new architecture that's evolving that we believe companies really need to take into consideration so they can actually create this flexible environment of taking advantage of the latest and greatest functional capabilities that are evolving in the marketplace and will continue to evolve at speed with massive disruption, but then also taking advantage of the data that exists not only within your enterprise, but that extended value chain and marketplace in a fundamentally different way. And that's what this new architecture actually provides. Akash, if we could move to the next slide. So, companies that we've seen, and clearly we're still at the early stages of, companies taking significant evolution in their supply chains and advantage of many of these capabilities, but those that have are already starting to see significant impact, right? And we all want to see, make investments that are driving overall growth, and you can see some of the percentage of overall revenue growth here, and also obviously the cost and growth balance, which is driving higher margin. So we're already starting to see where companies have made these investments. They're having significant positive financial impacts to their bottom line. So I know, we're trying to set up and we're going to bring some examples to life here, but just to close out, Akash, if we can move to the next slide, in summary, and really tying back to those building blocks, we truly do believe in a recommendation, for everyone that's wanting to take advantage of these capabilities and become much more customer centric. You have to think about the segmentation strategy and how do you drive a different supply chain strategy and capabilities to support those segments. Think about the asset-light supply chain and being able to take advantages of the capabilities that are evolving in the marketplace, drive that collaboration with ecosystem partners and players to get full integrated visibility across the value chain, and then also reinvent not only your internal operating model to take advantage of that, but have a vision for where you're trying to take the organization to take advantage of these capabilities and start to establish this underlying, living architecture to frankly be able to establish the technology that enables it all. So with that, I will hand it back over to Anand, and hopefully we'll continue the great conversation here.
Thank you, Mo. I think we've looked at the framework and the building components of resilient supply chain. Thank you so much for providing that perspective. I just wanted to get all the participants in. I think you were leading your supply chain. You're seeing different challenges. Having heard the different components, we just had a quick question to understand what would be the key capability your organization needs to prioritize for building resilience. So we have some options here, 5 options. The request is if you can go to Mentimeter, menti.com, just go on the Google and type menti.com. Once you go there, you will find this tab. Akash, are you able to just pull up the code for everyone to see? It's getting hidden in the screen. Yeah, there's a code. So if you can go to menti.com and use the code 670480, you just type in your responses to the 5 options that are there that we had, which is A, build an asset-light network, B, creating an end-to-end visibility, C, redefining the supply chain operating model, D, collaborate with ecosystem partners, and leverage digital and analytics technologies. What do you think is the key priority for your organization to build resilience? So we'll just give it a minute to get in your responses. visibility and technology and leverage is clearly coming out as the number one and two priorities. We'll just give a few more moments for everyone to type in the responses. Again, please go to menti.com in Google and use the code 670480 to type in your choice of what is the key capability your organization would need. All right, I think there is clearly a trend emerging. Visibility and leveraging digital and analytics technologies are clearly emerging as the priorities, which set really the foundation for a lot of other things to be enabled. Great. I think with that insight, let's move on to the next section, where we will look at some examples of how organizations have brought some of the concepts that we have spoken of to life and really transform the supply chains. So let's go to the next section. I hand it over to Vivek. Vivek, in case you're on, you can go next.
All right, thank you, Anand. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Vivek Luthra. I am based out of Accenture Singapore office, and I run our supply chain and operations business in growth markets. Across growth markets, we have quite a diverse set of clients and the type of supply chain services we provide. And I'm going to, build on what Mo spoke about, defining what a customer-centric supply chain looks like. And I'm going to be touching upon two aspects of a customer-centric supply chain. First one is how do you innovate in such a network? And second is around configuration of the supply chain so that you can actually tailor and personalize products and services to your customers. So if we move on, Kash, if you just progress to the next slide. So really, I saw in terms of responses, it was great to see so many people quickly responding. And I saw that the asset light network most probably was not as high in a priority, but I do want to kind of spend a couple of minutes to describe what does asset light net mean. And I saw a lot of weightage around leveraging digital technologies, which I think is kind of linked to it, and end-to-end visibility. So when we talk about asset light networks, we're talking about the core network of an organization, which is basically the entire supply chain, and how do we ensure there's visibility both on the demand side and the supply side. But what we have started to we've started seeing leaders adopt in a very different way, leveraging flexible asset light network. What does that mean? Let's take one or two examples to kind of bring it live for you, right? For example, ability to be able to crowdsource delivery on demand platform. What would that mean? That would mean the way fulfillment would happen, the way the transportation network would run for companies would be very different. Similar is the case on availability of a lot of last mile fulfillment platforms. If I take example on on-demand 3D printing, the way if you look at resources industries, capital projects, construction, that is totally changing the entire way of how about your overall network when it comes to supply chain. So really, what we mean by asset light network is the ability to be able to dip into the larger ecosystem, be able to still have demand end-to-end visibility, and then be able to use some of the digital technologies to still be able to provide the right kind of experience. I think this is really helping companies drive up their revenues, satisfy customers which they were not addressing with their own internal networks, and be able to do it in a way that experience could still be managed. So if we move to the next one, let me centric supply chain network works. So if you move to the next slide, please. So really, I want to quickly take you through an example, which has been a very key client for Accenture for a while. We've been working with a very large global network equipment major, And I want to talk about two aspects of this. And one is around the ability to innovate and to configure. I think we spoke about innovation being built on ability to be able to send signals from across different parts of your supply chain, whether it's on demand side or supply side. In this case, for our client, one of the key challenge for the client was it was basically kind of losing market share in terms of some of the new software and platform companies providing things like handsets and services in a much more agile way. So really, our client set about a journey where it worked on transforming its supply chain, which basically would enable it to double its revenues by implementing new types of business models in both software and services segment while keeping the same headcount. So it was a massive, massive initiative in terms of overall objectives. When we analyze the key challenges, I think there was obviously the challenge of lack of end-to-end collaboration and proactive business operation. What that meant was that while optimization was at each of the node level, end-to-end visibility and collaboration was basically resulting in a lot of business loss for the client. We also saw that the customer experience was not great. I mean, typically a customer, when ordering a product and the service, would typically, take 1 to 3 days to basically get to what they wanted. And a lot of times it was not configured to the individual customer needs. As you can imagine, given this industry, competition is intense, and the ability to be able to configure and personalize service with the product and service be very important. I think one of the fundamental principle and mindset shift for this client was shifting from a product to a product as a service mindset. And it is easier said than done. How do you actually then calibrate, your supply chain to do that? So really, we took multiple number of initiatives to be able to achieve that, right from setting up a supply chain innovation lab, which meant that the supply chain function transformed itself into a service-based function. So it defined a set of services which the larger organization could use, and these services were actually structured and defined around the actual outcomes which the business wanted. It was built on things like collaborative supply chain, setting up a control tower, which gave immense visibility end-to-end, leveraging a lot of automation and robotics, specifically in their warehouses, for example. And then I think moving on, leveraging some of the global operating model conditions to drive cost to serve lower, and then basically using some of the new ways of working in terms of digital architecture to be an end-to-end visibility. Simple examples like what would take typically anywhere upwards of 3 days, in a product as a service, the challenge would be actually provision that product as a service within 2 to 4 hours of customer asking. What did that mean? That mean that, for example, from a supply chain perspective, you had to build the capability. You had to build the platform where you could understand what is the existing digital footprint of a handset of a customer, for example. Being able to understand that, being able to allow the customer to load it on a platform was the start of it. Using that then to be able to personalize and actually make sure that the warehouse which was fulfilling that demand was able to personalize both the hardware and the software and provide that as a service, as a bundled product as a service, within 2 to 4 hours of customer demanding it. That totally experience. So really, I think this involved the transformation of end-to-end supply chain by leveraging and orchestrating supply chain services, which the larger organization could consume, the entire blueprinting, designing the future state, and implementation of those services in an agile fashion, introducing those services in select segments, experimenting, learning from it, and then scaling it up. The second part was all around digitalization of the supply chain function using this microservices architecture. I think we see leaders use this a lot more now, so that it's easy for supply chain function to work with different parts of the business to be able to be more impactful and relevant to the larger business with a very lightweight architecture on different parts of the network. As a result of that, what our client was able to do was it completely transformed, right? The overall, the OTIF percentage metrics, was increased by 20%, which meant, in time fulfillment of 20% incremental benefits, 60% increase in inventory turns. Now they were using the supply chain platforms to get much better demand signals and hence be able to align their overall inventory plans as per that. And you can imagine for this business, it is quite a key aspect in terms of profitability. Mo spoke about how customer-centric supply chain are delivering key benefits, right? One is around uplift in revenue, which he spoke about, and then obviously in terms of how does it help in improving EBITDA as well. So I think those two becomes very important when you start thinking about inventory turns. How do you align it to customer needs? 70% reduction in order fulfillment lead times. We spoke about simple concepts around product as a service. How do you think about configuring your supply chain to move from a product-based supply chain to a product as a service supply chain? I think a lot of our customers, not only this, but others are investing in transforming their supply chain around these concepts. And obviously, all this leaded to 30% reduction in the overall supply chain cost, which was largely because of being, asset light kind of network, which was leveraged for improving service levels. So that was just one example around, how do we think about innovating and then configuring your supply chain, keeping in mind what types of tailored and personalized, product and services need to be delivered to your customer. If I move on to the second example, I would just take a very different example of a little bit more double clicking into configuration. This is a client we've been working with here in Southeast Asia for a while. It's a large global beauty retail major. As you can imagine, over the last few months, for all retail majors, the share of e-commerce as a sales channel has increased a lot. What basically meant was insufficient capacity in logistics network for our clients. In terms of also what they were following was a centralized supply chain model, which was basically increasing their cost and lead time as the volumes were growing. So with this context in mind, also I think the way the network was designed, there was lack of automation, mechanization in DCs, which was catering to relatively lower volumes. And as the volume was picking up, I think there was a need to kind of further automate the way DCs were being run. And last but not the least, ability to be able that in today's world, ability to be able to do have end-to-end visibility, holistically manage the supply chain end-to-end, be able to do scenario planning, and then use those to apply interventions becoming a very was to basically design an asset-light network design for them. We started working on, can you actually, for some markets, the DC model was. So on this retail client of ours, if you go back one slide, Akash, thank you. So really, I think we were speaking about an asset-light network. I think we were in the final conclusion part of what we were talking about. So largely, we actually redesigned the overall network in terms of configurations, DC points. We also changed some of the DCs to become omni-channel. For example, it was more cost economical for a DC in a particular market to actually service multiple type of needs, including e-commerce. Earlier, they were organized around different channels being serviced by the configuration of the supply chain was different. We also worked around DC automation with 3PL. We kind of worked on their overall longer tenure contract, in return for which we were able to define, agree, and then work on an implementation plan for specific DC automation, which kind of drove a lot of EBITDA improvements for them. And we were able to kind of work on leveraging digital supply chain as a service. I think we are seeing this as a very common phenomena in terms of leaders, supply chain masters, using and adopting their own supply chain models to as a service models within the larger context of the organization, which are basically built on some of the tenements which all of you actually put as high priority: ability to have visibility end to end and leveraging a lot of digital technologies. This is helping this client of ours to uplift planning and logistics analytics capability. Some of the key initiatives were around how did we decentralize the supply chain? Earlier, they were servicing most part of, for example, Southeast Asia through one DC, which was not working that well for being able to work on automation on DCs and going through a strategic sourcing process for that. centralization of direct to store shipments. I think that became very important in certain markets for them, given the volumes, given the overall cost economics. And then in terms of leveraging store network for fulfillment, I spoke about it a little bit, that Omni, making some of the network nodes to be omni-channel, and leveraging 4PL for logistics management and supply chain control tower, which became key part of the then planning and replenishment. With all these measures, we were really able to deliver upwards of 25% reduction in the supply chain cost. For specific markets, we were able to benefit for them is the client is right now much more ready. While they started this initiative a little bit ahead of the COVID context, so I think they feel that they are much more geared up today to further scale up, as things further grow in the new type of business environment which we are all in, right? So hopefully these two examples give you how can supply chains be used to innovate, keeping customer at the center, and then how do you, as you start personalizing tailored products and services, how do you configure your supply chain to be able to service those customers? And from here, I'll pass it back to Akash, and I think we'll have questions at the end.
Thanks, Vivek, and hi everyone. It's me back. So thanks for bringing to life the concept of innovate and configure with those insightful case studies. We will now look at the next part of the supply chain framework that we spoke about, and look at how examples across connected supply chains and how is more articulated. It is an integral part of the customer centricity. If you look at really this slide, leading organizations deploy multiple platforms that provide functional improvements. We have planning platforms like Kinaxis JDA that enable end-to-end constraint optimization, collaboration, and scenario analysis capabilities. We have logistics platform like GTNets, ROMD that enable capabilities to progress across various manufacturing substages, enable schedule modification, and enable throughput enhancement. And finally, we have sourcing platforms like Ariba to enable automated source to contract and procure to pay capabilities, along with assessing supplier risk and driving cost and availability improvements. However, if all of these platforms operate in silos, the power remains unutilized. A connected supply chain requires, first of all, to set up these platforms and then tie them all together using an intelligent brain as the underlying new gen digital technology enabler, utilizing cloud, AI, etc. This unleashes the true collective power of a digital solution to provide two critical aspects. One, a seamless interoperability across assets, processes, and people within and across your organizations, as well as advanced analytical capabilities that create insights and drive autonomous execution. So really, this is what a connected supply chain is able to achieve. Give you end-to-end visibility within and across your organization, give you interoperability across multiple platforms and data sets, whether it's your supply database, your logistics provider database, your manufacturing database, and enable you to really drive a lot of execution capabilities. So that's really a bit about Connect, and let's look at two examples that will bring this to life. For the first case study, I will like to invite, I'm privileged to invite our client Sunil Kumar, who will walk us through what has been the thinking at their organization as they have embarked on this journey. Sunil, if you could unmute.
Yeah. Hi, Akash. Thank you. Right. So the company that I work for has set itself some ambitious growth plans to grow in the next 5 years. And we have grown traditionally through acquisitions. So what we realized is that supply chain capabilities is a key pillar to deliver this growth. And if I look at where we are today, we have a very largely manual, people-dependent ways of working. And it's very siloed. So we want to transform ourselves into a more agile supply chain, and through having integrated processes that is more system driven. People are using data to make decisions, and we want to get more closer to customers, like real-time demand sensing kind of stuff. That's our end goal kind of stuff, a vision. And we have realized that this is a journey that we'll have to take, and we have got a roadmap for it with different phases. And we are in the starting phase of the project, and then we have partnered with Accenture to help us with this journey. What we're looking at as part of this particular phase is we are looking at things like supply chain strategy. We are looking at segmentation, planning parameters, inventory strategy. We are looking at then coming down to the actual processes itself. Our processes are currently very rudimentary, so we're going to put a robust process for demand planning, inventory planning, supply planning, S&OP. And then we get down to things like organizational structure. Do we have an integrated planning organization, or do we keep different elements of planning in different parts of the organization? So we're having debates about that. We're looking at KPIs and shared KRAs across the entire supply chain. And then we get down to the actual enablement through technology. So we have a digital planning platform that we have chosen, and we are in the process of configuring that now. And then, of course, the end bit is all about what the outcome is, so what kind of stuff. So what we're hoping to achieve is get end-to-end visibility of the supply chain. So we respond to customers in a much more agile fashion. We want to move away from being people dependent, so it's more automated planning. We want to be able to use data to make these decisions. And we want to build some sort of control tower to monitor the end-to-end supply chain health and respond to the needs of the supply chain. And what we're hoping to get out of all this at the end of the journey is the primary goal is to get scalability. So we are a growing business, so we want scalability. The current processes are not scalable. And the second most important bit is we want to improve our fill rates to our customers and reduce our lost sales. We want to, at the same time, optimize working capital and reduce our costs in the entire end-to-end supply chain. And we have just begun our journey, and process and technology are two levers. And we're also looking at people capability to be able to deliver all these goals kind of stuff.
Thanks, Sunil. I think it's a wonderful example of how you've chosen to embark on this journey to really build scalable processes and as part of the journey deliver business outcomes. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful example. With that, I will hand it over now to Vismay Jani, my colleague, to talk about one of the case studies that he's implemented. Over to you, Vismay.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome. I'm Vismay and part of Bangalore Accenture team here. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a supply chain transformation that we are running for a global pharmaceutical major who has significant operations also in India. And in the current context and the way things are panning out with the pandemic, I think this is extremely relevant in terms of what the client is doing and how they've managed to bring in key elements of digitization, collaboration, and what if scenario simulation to be able to bring the organization to a state they're able to respond very effectively to the current pandemic and future potentially to all supply chain disruptions that may hit them. So the key challenges were obviously, as you can see on the slide, a large inventory tied up into their network. So as a pharma company, they believe their serviceability needs to be very high, but they are operating in a way that doesn't allow them to bring in efficiencies when they look at the cost to serve. Beyond that, the planning process and the S&OP cycles were long, so they were missing out on the agility that is required in times like now or even otherwise where supply chains have generally become very reactive. The third objective they were trying to solve for is globally really trying to bring a landscape which is homogeneous from a tech standpoint so that users across the globe almost have an Amazon-like experience when they log on to their supply chain planning solutions, right? So one of the end goals is, can we really make the organizational processes and mechanisms so consistent that ultimately I use that as a mechanism to drive behaviors that result in meeting organization a supply chain. And finally, being in India, the India arm has a lot of contract manufacturers, which also means a tremendous amount of handholding, stakeholder management, and collaboration, the need for which was not getting fulfilled without adequate digitization. So what they embarked on was a 4 to 5 year journey. They are in year 3, and they have almost nearly completed rolling out a highly digitized platform for managing supplier collaboration and supply chain planning in their India business and few other businesses globally. As you can see, the value case tied to this transformation was significantly large. They have inventory in the range of about 8 to 9 billion, and they were expecting to free up almost $1 billion worth of inventory from this program, which would almost make this program self-paying. Beyond that, though, they are using this program to set organizational behavior. So they want to get to a state where everybody is looking at a single business plan, so that all objectives are driven to achieving the same set of KPIs. There's also very strong focus on the client side on driving decision making that is tightly integrated to the financial plans, right? So really not making decisions that are in a silo, but all the time looking at what my decisions, how my decisions impact my top line and my bottom line. Clearly, they wanted to be as real time as possible in reacting to disruptions. So they wanted to have ability to simulate scenarios in a very short time, to be able to make decisions in a very short time, and be able to respond to any evolving scenarios in their operations. And lastly, they also wanted to use the same capabilities to roll up and make strategic decisions. So they wanted to not use this for tactical and operational planning only, but really also roll this up into making long-term strategic plans on capacity, on manpower, and other things. So this is a short spiel on what this client is doing. And again, the benefits they are realizing are quite significant. With that, and given that we are running a little bit late, I will once again thank you all for the opportunity to allow me to share this, and thank you again for your participation today. Have a good evening, folks.
Amit, if you could come in now.
Yeah, thanks, Akash. Very good evening. So far, I think what we've talked about are two critical aspects of supply chain. We've talked about configure, which basically covered how supply chains can be transformed into asset-light models, which are more responsive to customer needs. And secondly, we covered connect, which included the importance of developing capabilities for real-time planning and seamless visibility. Now, the third part of supply chain, basically optimize, which is what I will be talking about, is essentially something that brings both of these aspects together. Simply put, it basically, this is the part wherein a planner really puts his or her supply chain plan into execution, right? If you see the schematic on the slide, it essentially calls out the entire planning come execution process across 6 steps. And I think most of us will be able to relate to this in some form or shape. I think this is what we all leverage, albeit at different levels of advancement and automation. Fundamentally, a planner starts by capturing raw data from various sources, and he classifies this data in buckets such as event data, timelines, location, etc. He uses this data to basically create a demand plan or a forecast using demand analytics, AI, and various other tools. This demand plan is basically then disaggregated into an inventory and a supply plan using predefined business rules. And then this supply plan is something that gets communicated to the entire supply network using various collaboration platforms and blockchain. Basically, it gets translated into POs for our LSPs, gets translated into POs for our suppliers, and also orders onto our manufacturing network. Now, this is basically step 1 to 4, and this is where planning ends. Execution and monitoring of execution is something that starts after this, right? And essentially, most of the leaders in today's day and age basically rely on a robust decision support system to basically monitor execution and to identify any outliers, to kind of course correct so that there is absolutely no disruption in supply chain. Akash, if you can just go to the next slide, please. So essentially, this decision support system basically translates into something called a control tower. I'm sure a lot of us would have heard about this. Simply put, a control tower is nothing but a set of cross-functional capabilities which is enabled by people, process, technology, that connects data from disparate sources and helps ensuring better and faster decision making, right? So it has three layers. The first layer is essentially the visibility layer. The second layer is a performance improvement or an analytics layer, and the third layer is a sense and react or a what if layer. Now the visibility layer basically taps into real-time data from various sources, which basically talks about how the current supply chain is actually operating, right? Then the analytics layer essentially compares data of the current supply chain with historical data and basically identifies outliers and identifies exceptions. And then the what if layer basically does scenario building and helps identify alternate ways to basically deploy supply chain processes so as to course correct and basically to avoid any disruptions per se. Akash, if you can just go to the next slide, please. So I think one of the leading examples that I actually want to talk about is the work that we've done with a global paints company in China, wherein we've implemented and we are currently running a logistics control tower, right, to deliver seamless visibility into their transportation operations. And we've also delivered in the process tangible savings, right? So this client is a multinational, it's a leading paints company, but despite being a leader in the category, it suffers from very typical logistics issues, which I think most of us will be able to relate to. There is minimal transparency in transport execution. There is a lot of reactive and local event handling, multiple interfaces with our different logistics service providers, gaps in cross BU planning and execution, and most importantly, a dearth or limitation in the manpower and the skills that are actually available, right? So as a part of this project, what Accenture actually did was we implemented a TMS, a JDA TMS, to enable firstly end-to-end transportation management processes. We put all these processes onto a system. And on top of this, in order to create visibility, we basically also created multiple dashboards using Tableau. So what this actually enabled is real-time visibility into transportation KPIs, such as loading performance, on-time delivery, number of customer complaints, tons kilometer per delivery, and cost per kilogram, right? And this is a control tower that Accenture is actually running for the client based out of one of Accenture facilities, right? So this whole project has not only delivered significant savings, $7 million, as you can see on the slide, but more importantly has helped standardize processes for the client and really plug gaps in their logistics process, right? So that's Optimize in a nutshell. I would now request Vineet to talk about Operate.
Hi Akash, can you see and hear me?
Yeah, I can see and hear you now, please.
Right, so good evening everybody again, Vineet here. Happy to be speaking to you. As I take the Operate section, right, and as you eyeball the slide, the core of this section is innovation in supply chain beyond what is obvious for added value, right? But before we reach that stage in Operate, there are two preceding stages, right, or two important milestones, not necessarily prerequisite but important, which is the ability to industrialize and variabilize supply chain. What do we mean by that? Industrialize means the ability to make a process repeatable and reliable. Day in and day out, a same process is done exactly the same way, and therefore there is control and predictability. Variabilize means maybe externalize, but more importantly, the ability to ramp up or ramp down of the capacity in line with demand at a granular level of time or geography or business. We know of two large companies in India who do this. First is one of the largest FMCG companies, which has automated and outsourced large parts of supply chain planning and execution, so that the company focuses only on the strategic supply chain decisions and is focused on adding incremental value. Basically, separate operations and constructive value add. There is another company, a large Alcobev company in India, which has chosen to convert supply chain as a center of excellence and hand it over to Accenture to run it as a service. And it is this that I will elaborate. Their stated position was to focus on strategy, brands, and RTM as competitive differentiator and convert everything else as a service. So how did we go about this and how did this happen? I'll elaborate that over the next couple of slides. As mentioned, And moving on to the next slide, this is in the Alcobev context. Every sector is unique. The uniqueness over here is that goods do not cross over state boundaries. There are states are self-contained units of demand and supply. There are factories and depots in every state, and therefore, in effect, there are 30 SNOPs, right? So that's the uniqueness. But yet, every aspect of what you see on these couple of slides would be applicable to any client across almost every sector in India and abroad. So this started with the aspect of supply chain transformation, a typical one, and we define transformation as a comprehensive change in supply chain strategy, process, org, and technology. So when we bring about comprehensive change in each one of them in a short burst of time, we call it transformation. What are the underpins? To begin with, segmented and differentiated strategy, supply chain strategy, right? So pick the large parts of business, for example, the A-class SKUs, right, which behave differently. Right? They cover large part of the value. Program the supply chain for high fill rate closer to the customer, for example, and so on and so forth. Many such segments with differentiated design, right? So the ability to simultaneously have differentiated design optimizes and maximizes business value. Then technology tools which automate world-class processes supported with KPI dashboard and so on. The emphasis in the first stage, which is the first column that you see, the first 1.5 years, was, if I can use the word, bring method to madness. Once there was control and visibility of the 30 odd SNOPs, then the power of the core solution would take over and benefits would follow, which is what happened. So if you see on the right hand side, from the baseline, we started from the baseline, and what you see in the middle is the benefit or the key KPIs at the end of 1 year, and which therefore were already approaching industry best in class standards. It was at this stage that the client mentioned to us or invited us to take this over and provide this in form of SLAs or provide supply chain as a service. How did we go about it? To begin with, industrialize. As I mentioned upfront, repeatability and reliability. And once that happens, infuse it with analytics and multiple digital interventions that you can see in the columns 2 and 3. And it is required to push the boundary of value, because the basic or the low-hanging fruits or the first frontiers of value have been realized, and then thereafter one has to push the boundary. I'll call out two, right? And I'll elaborate only on one. But the first which comes to my mind is an RPA. Right? As I mentioned, there are 30 odd supply chains. While there was method to madness, but still when we would conduct, say, SNOP, right, national SNOP, there were 30 state SNOPs, 4 regional, then 1 national. Even collating data, information, intelligence, and deriving insight was a laborious job prone to error. It would take effort of many person weeks. Then when we automated it through a bot, we were able, you wouldn't believe it, we were able to do it in 5 minutes flat. We are now in a stage where we are writing a neuro-linguistic programming to eliminate human intervention, even in the inciting and strategic conclusions, after which a person will only eyeball what the machine makes. But this is a good example of automation. I'll not elaborate this one. Instead, over the next slide, and by the way, through all of these initiatives, we did reach absolute best in class across multiple industries that you see on the rightmost side, such that the COE becomes self-sustaining and self-value adding, right? So I will elaborate on one aspect, which is machine learning based forecasting. Why do I pick this, which is there on the next slide as we move on, right? And the reason to pick this is that almost every company will have such niches where this is applicable, and it can add a reasonable value in a short burst of time after traditionally sophisticated solutions such as what we deployed reach their limit. Now, Often there will be niches which have very high demand volatility. In this case, say the premium brands, right? High volatility worsened by the fact that the supply, the RMPM supply lead times were long because they were imported, adding to complexity, translating it to high inventory and relative low fill rate. So while we had cracked large parts of the business that we saw on the previous slide, there were niches or pockets which one hadn't cracked. And that is when one deployed machine learning forecasting. The details is on the bottom side, but the details do not matter. The core of the value was unlocked through two things. First, a far more sophisticated analytics algorithm. So while our previous digital demands forecasting solution was constrained by limited set of models which were off the shelf, this one had more sophisticated and could create customized models for this context. This was one difference. The second was that so far we were largely forecasting on company internal data, sound robust data, taking in promotions, but still internal data. Machine learning took in external data, not of competition, but environment, and identified correlations between things which may not be intuitive, right? So weather, for example, here was not intuitive, but it identified a correlation, and combining it with external markers, being able to significantly improve forecast accuracy. And once that happens, automatically fill rate improves and inventory drops. Now, while this example is in Elcobev, we have seen similar results, say in another Indian food company for RM commodity RM, and we have also seen it in a beauty cosmetic player where we did this for stat forecasting for their e-commerce channel, which had even higher variability than this. So in all these pockets, we got equally good results. In summary, every good supply chain designed should be a source of competitive advantage, both tactically and strategically. In this case, I'll give you a couple of examples tactically and then end my part. Most recently, because of COVID outbreak, we knew that opportunity will present itself, which happened. And in one particular case, the competitor slipped in supply. It was large strategic opportunity for us, and for a largish portfolio or segment, we were able to increase our market share on back of good supply chain agility by almost 1.5x at a national level. Now, this advantage, because it is not supply led or not demand, will gradually tone down, but RTM or RTM advantages, part of it can remain permanent. So supply chain can be a source of advantage. I'll take another example. Last year when there was transporter strike, often disruptions happen, and I can tell you that transport strikes are rarely unexpected. It may be unexpected in head office, but they are rarely truly unexpected. We were, through our daily control tower, able to pick signals, and we built the right buffer at the right levels or echelons to the right extent. Thereby, because in spite of a heavy disruption, the loss of primary or secondary was near zero. Right? Tertiary is difficult to forecast, but primary, secondary was near zero. This was tactical. Strategically, as we mentioned, on every aspect of improved fill rate or revenue, cost and inventory, there were marked improvements. And therefore, through industrializing, innovating and variabilizing or higher order of operate, supply chain can be a source of value and competitive advantage. Thank you. And Anand, back to you.
Thanks, Vineet. If we can move on, I think come to the last part of this, and we will quickly get into the questions. I know. I just wanted to get your sense. You saw the building blocks of how we can build a resilient supply chain. Akash, just go back for a minute to the PowerPoint, please. I just wanted to, we saw the building blocks. I just wanted to understand, what is your perspective on what do you see as the biggest obstacle to overcome in developing the future supply chain in your organizations? And the options really are, multiple. Many times it's a lack of a clear roadmap or a vision of where we want to go. There's lack of funding. You see the team capabilities as a big challenge. functional and organizational barriers coming in the way, or simply the underlying data and technology infrastructure. So these are the options, and we wanted to hear again. If you can go to menti.com, and Akash, if you can switch now and use the same code 670480 to sort of share your responses. Yes, interesting observations. Clearly, the data readiness and the technology infrastructure readiness to sort of start this journey is coming out to be one of the biggest hindrances. Though I would not underestimate the other points and issues that we have, clearly, which is about building a business case, which is coming out as the next sort of big issue or a big challenge. The organizational silos, and in some cases, obviously, also having the vision and the roadmap of where we want to go. I think clearly those are some of the things that are emerging. We've seen examples of all of these as we discuss with multiple clients. Surprisingly, the first part of where do we want to go and what is it that we want to achieve is also a very important part, and we can see some questions and responses flowing in that direction as well now, because that really sets what we need to do in terms of the technology and infrastructure, and how do we build the business case, and therefore how do we fund it. So I think with those trends and insights, I think we can move on, Akash. So I'll quickly summarize, and we just in the last 5 minutes, and we'll take questions. So really, what are the toolkits? What did we sort of share with you today? I think in order to build a resilient supply chain, I think clearly we looked at multiple aspects. On the left, you see really a framework or a way of thinking about different components of this resilient supply chain, which is how do we build capabilities to innovate, which is connected products as a service, personalization. We looked at configuring the supply chain, where we looked at segmentation and being asset light, which is really about collaborations and partnerships. We looked at connect, where we looked at laying the underlying platforms of planning, control towers, laying out all the hardware and plumbing of technology that we would really look at to lay all of this out, enable the visibility. We looked at operate, where we are really looking at the operating model of what we want to do in-house, what we want to outsource, where do we want to automate. And then we looked at the last leg of optimize, which is really about leveraging the power of analytics to bring about continuous improvement and optimization in this entire supply chain. So we looked at all these building blocks to look at how do we build a resilient supply chain. On the right side are various tools and assets which help us achieve this goal. So right from assessing our maturity about for the end-to-end supply chain and undertaking a digital supply chain transformation, we have an asset to help us understand how the maturity across various elements and where do we need to start. There are segmentation apps which can be leveraged to look at what micro segments we need to identify and target. There are multiple planning platforms, be it SAP, IBP, be it JDA can access again to help us build the connect plumbing and the backbone really. There are multiple tools available to do the network configuration and look at various scenarios, do what if capabilities, find out what is working, what's not working, what's the scenario we need to go ahead. And that's also something which we need to look at as we fundamentally rethink where do we want to continue operating, where do we need to get out of and relocate post-COVID. Obviously on track and trace, there are multiple control tower offerings that are available. There are risk tools available. And last but not the least, the capability of the people, because it's eventually our people who are going to make it happen. So what are the learning assets, and how are we really enabling the learning of our team to make all of this happen? So these are all the tools that we have. If you go to the next page, Akash. And really, how do we start building this journey? Now, there are 4 or 5 ways of thinking about it. There are 4 or 5 components, and there is no set prescription here. I think there are, depending on where your organization is in terms of thinking on all of these aspects, the right roadmap in your organization's context need to be built. But the first is really to set the North Star. So what are the customer experiences we want to deliver? What are the capabilities we need to deliver those customer experiences? What is the business case that we want to gun for? And build a roadmap around that, and what are the quick wins? So really setting this North Star up, which is very important. Then embracing collaboration, so co-innovating across the ecosystem, partnering with people, be it in the logistics space, fulfillment space, across the supply chain, and leveraging the capabilities which are there. In fact, as Accenture, we partner with over 5,000 startups which are really innovating across industries and functions to really bring the best of the solutions to our clients. Organize yourself around the customer outcomes and not as functional silos. The third aspect is about digital, growing a digital workforce. It's very important. There, again, 2-3 things to look at: defining what is it that we are going to do ourselves, which is build, what is it that we're going to buy from outside, what is it that we're going to automate. So taking those fundamental operating model decisions, defining the future roles and capabilities. The roles we have will not be necessarily the roles that will need to work and operate and succeed in this environment. We will have network configurators, we'll have supply chain orchestrators, and we'll have very new roles that will get created, which we'll need to define and enable and build skills of our team. And last but not the least, on the first part is focusing on value creation. You saw one of our clients speak about the fact that this is not a digitization or a technology enablement way to look at it. We need to really define first the new ways of working, the new processes. We don't want to digitize the as-is processes. Leverage a sprint-based approach to driving tangible outcomes of the business case that we have set, and constantly keep aligning the technology requirements to the business needs to ensure that we are in sync and we don't run too far ahead of ourselves. And the bottom engine, which came as really the big priority or the sort of challenge to overcome, which is revving up the digital engine, which is basically looking at the platform, the end-to-end platform that we want to enable, feed it with the right data, connect it with the right data and insights, and really leveraging the power of AI, automation, and IoT. So it's this engine and connection of all of these elements that we need to define this roadmap for ourselves. So I think that's what we had to share. I think let's now go to the Q&A. Over to you, Amit. What are some of the questions that we are seeing? And I'll request more Vivek, Vineet also to jump in and sort of address some of these things. Over to you, Amit.
Sure, Anand. Thanks. First question is to Mo. The question is, how are we seeing supply chain organizations respond to the current crisis in developed markets like US?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so the U.S. it's really segmented by different industries. I would say that, certain industries like the retail industry has been, because of the disruption by many of the competitors, as you know, Amazon has completely disrupted that, has forced many retailers to actually completely re-engineer their supply chain. So that industry is actually driven very, very quickly just to be able to survive. Then you have what I would consider some of the touch point industries that are leveraging some of the same capabilities. If you think about consumer goods industries that are actually, starting to build some of their own retail footprints and also driving direct to consumer channel capabilities themselves, they're actually starting to adapt many of these capabilities and disrupt their own supply chains to be able to support that as a growth engine itself. Communications and high tech is, for the same reasons, is making many investments. And then also, if you think about the collaboration aspects from an operate perspective, I would say that life sciences and the pharmaceutical industry is really pressed very hard on driving from a product innovation standpoint, in particular with the recent situation there, it's even enhanced, but before that it was already enhanced with some of their collaboration through retail distribution. So we do see, different segments of industries actually focusing on different components of the supply chain for disruption. But, I would say that there are very few companies that have really taken a full end-to-end view and driven the full disruption. Most of that is happening, frankly, with some of the new emerging companies that have kind of built their supply chains from scratch versus having to adjust existing supply chains which are already in place.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Mo. I see a few hands in the chat window. Let's start with Mr. Vijay Dubey. Mr. Dubey, can you please ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, in this entire context, specifically with respect to the Indian environment, where do we see the the SME and the MSME sector in this entire thing in terms of adoption of technology and cost?
Sure. Anand, would you want to take that?
I think clearly there is definitely a lot of challenge in terms of adoption of technology. But I think the good news is also that a lot of the tier one companies with which they are working have realized the importance of how critical role the MSME sector plays in driving the overall end-to-end value chain, and are undertaking a lot of initiatives from their end as well to enhance their collaboration with some of these partners. So for example, we've seen multiple clients within life sciences now look at undertaking blockchain-based solutions to really look at order visibility and status of their outsourced manufacturing with their contract manufacturers. So that's really picking up steam. In fact, we sort of partnered with Indian Pharmaceutical Association just a couple of weeks ago to really deep dive into a lot of issues and understand the key enablers that we need to recommend to bring the MSME sector aligned with a lot of these initiatives that we need to bring in. And in fact, that report also has been released. So I think overall, yes, they are behind the curve, but there is greater intent to undertake some of these initiatives, and they are being supported by a lot of those tier one players in terms of greater integration and visibility as they drive this forward.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Mr. Hitesh Madan, you can ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Hitesh from Voltas. I had, it was very interesting to listen Vineet, when he spoke about the forecasting part, and he said that there was a robotic or automized, forecasting, where one thing I just wanted to ask you, by doing that, what was the percentage of forecast accuracy we got? And second thing, parallel to this, he mentioned that, we take external data from the environment. Okay, so this environment data is just again an assumption, or we are talking about the actual sellout data from the customers. I think in this entire session, since starting, we missed out one thing, which is sellout data, actually sellout data in secondary and tertiary markets, which actually gives you the correct insight of what exactly we are doing in a primary forecasting, whether that is working it or not. And that is directly related to the fill ratio and the turnaround and the manufacturing. I just wanted to ask, Vineet, what exactly he meant by this external environment data. Was it sellout data from the customer, or this is again the normal, you can say, from the industry or the trend, the data which was collected and panelized on the basis of that?
Right. You can hear me, Amit, right? Vineet here.
Yeah, this is
Yes.
Hitesh.
Yeah,
This is
Hitesh,
Hitesh.
hi. Yeah, great
Yeah.
question. Good question. And maybe the answer is relevant for everybody. I'll answer in three parts or three subparts. First, what was the improvement? So roughly the forecast accuracy, I mean, the metric is MAPE, was early 60s. It went to near 80, right? So, but as I said, there were two other cases also, right? E-commerce in the beauty company, and then there was the foods Indian major where it was RM commodity. So everywhere we see that those niches, the improvement in forecast accuracy is 20-30%, right? And 30% is huge because you reach a stagnation with typical traditional methods. So that is one part of the answer. The second here, or maybe I'll add, in the case study I mentioned, everything was based on secondary data, right? One did not have access to tertiary. You are right, most companies do it on primary. So as you move from primary to secondary, even if in parts, and then move to tertiary, even in smaller parts, these become very important signals. So that case study or slide didn't talk of, but you raise a very valid point. Even if they are small pockets but representative, moving from primary to tertiary improves the source of signal into supply chain planning. That was second. Third, I think what's good about machine learning also is, see, very often you do not have the ability to gather secondary and tertiary data. You are constrained by the RTM. Instead, if you can gather a lot of other environment data, which over here was, as we said, it can be various things. It can be crude prices, it can be weather, it can be, say, a population rate of increase, it can be disease, it can be whatever. But whatever is available in public domain, if you put it in the machine learning engine, it analyzes what are correlated to demand and then forecasts it accordingly. Here, weather had an important parameter, and holidays, weather and holidays.
Yeah, I think thanks, Vineet, because the question why particularly I picked up this sellout, because I did an almost 1 year, 1.5 year complete study on this tertiary data while I was in LG Electronics, which is again consumer durable. So I have seen, there is a huge scope if we get actually, and that is again related to what we were talking about in data improvement and in improving the technology. Now
Right.
the major hurdle is that we know what is being sold, we know Excel data, but actually at secondary and tertiary level, we are not connected with the technology to them.
I'm
So,
happy to have an offline conversation to help you maximize what is possible in your situation.
Yeah. Anyways, it was just my point which I raised it. So I think it will be helpful for everyone. This is.
That's right, Hitesh. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking and pitching in. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Madan. We have Mr. Raghavan Santhanam, who's also raised his hand. Mr. Santhanam, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to check with you. I mean, I'm sure you would be working with different banking industry clients, right? And now with, the open banking or Sahmati in India, more or less, on the annual, just wanted to understand, how, naturally the banking systems are very siloed and there are legacy systems. So when you say asset-light systems, how are you handling it in banking and reshaping their business model? And in terms of asset light, how do you take care when the underlying systems are itself pretty antiquated and legacy? Just wanted, your views since you deal with multiple clients.
Sure. Mo, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, the whole financial sector for supply chain has been pretty light, to be honest with you. We haven't done as much in the banking sector. Most of our services there are in other spaces versus supply chain. I will tell you though, on the architecture question that you're having, what companies are dealing with is, investments in, let's say, functional capabilities, what they're actually trying to prove out some of these concepts, whether that's, enhanced, forecasting ability through data science, which was touched on earlier, better improved visibility, through control tower investments and capability, focusing in on investments around automation and warehousing and transportation, etc. So people, from an architecture perspective, they're kind of tackling functional solutions, but then as they're going through that, they're identifying the architecture need, which ties back to what we discussed as far as setting up a data infrastructure that is allowing you to actually ingest data in a fundamentally different way and actually drive and take advantage of some of these automation. And unfortunately, that is requiring a bit of a re-engineering from some of the antiquated, system architecture that exists out there to actually get onto a more advanced data at a minimum data architecture to be able to take advantage of the data that's required to drive some of these advancements. I hope that helped.
I think, I'm just conscious of time. We are 5 minutes over time already. So you see the contact details of myself, Amit, and Akash on the screen. We would request you to share any of your thoughts and questions that you would have on the email IDs that you see on your screen, and we'll be very happy to sort of connect and respond to all the questions that you would have, now or as we go along over the next few days. So probably we can just take one last question and then we can end the session.
Sure. I think we have Mr. Rajesh Pednekar. Mr. Pednekar, please go ahead. Please ask your question.
Yeah, so thank you for a wonderful presentation. My question is on the pharma industry. I could note that, a couple of times you referred to the industry. So I'm ex-senior director with Cipla, and as an industry, we are heavily dependent on China with almost 70% of our raw material excipients, KSM, that is key starting material, coming from China. So what is your advice to the industry for de-risking the supply chain? What is that you foresee? How would the pharma industry react to de-risking their supply chain from China?
Anand, would you want to answer that?
Yes, I think that's a very good question, and I think clearly, I think two things. One, there are a lot of there is a government support and government initiative that we are seeing now, really to encourage the de-risking of this situation that we have, which is the excessive dependence on China for KSMs, and really encouraging a lot of entrepreneurs and companies in India to set up capacities. The talent is there, the skills are there, all the raw materials and the building blocks are there. So I think clearly, one, there is a government push now to encourage more domestic manufacturing, and two, I think companies have also realized the risk that their supply chains had during the last 3-4 months, and I think that also is become a big trigger for them to look at backward integration, really looking at which are the specific places where they need to invest in order to build these capacities. There are a lot. The third force that is happening is a lot of companies are also now looking at de-risking their manufacturing footprint and looking at various geographies as options to set up capacities, and that also is a investment trigger that we see which will enable capacities to be built in India in that. So all in all, I feel greater government encouragement, companies exiting China, looking at India as a favorable destination, and the large base of Indian formulations manufacturing also now looking at de-risking this through backward integration. All three, we believe, will be strong, forces that would see more capacities being built and this risk reducing over a period of time.
Okay, thanks, Anand. I think we have one last question. This is from Mr. Rajiv Ranjan. Mr. Ranjan, please go ahead.
Hi, I have two questions. Am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. So first question is there an objective way to measure the level of resiliency a current supply chain have? And vis-a-vis, second question is for an organization, let's say an FMCG major between 2,000 to 4,000 crore turnover, what are the tools of all the tools that we discussed today, from your experience, are required to be there in a mid-sized FMCG company for it to be reach a resiliency which is among the top tier?
Vivek, are you there? You have seen can you take this question?
Okay, thank you. So, so I think a couple of things, right? We are generally seeing a lot of our clients invest in capabilities which allow them to do very detailed data science-led scenario, which means that, largely because some of the old consumption-based models are not valid, at least now, and the way different industries are coming out of the present scenario is also going to be very different. So we are seeing resiliency as the ability to be able to react, building on the end-to-end visibility and being able to, do scenario modeling in as close to real time as possible. In fact, as Accenture, we've started to do some work with MIT globally around the whole stress testing of supply chains, and I think it's something which Anand and team can take, and we can come back to specific people in the audience where interest is. But largely, I think we are seeing resiliency being measured in the ability to be able to look at data holistically and be able to do scenario modeling in as close to real time as possible. And I think different companies are taking different approaches, but largely that's something which we're seeing consistently across our clients. They are investing in building these capabilities across the region right now as we talk. I think that would be most probably the number two after the cost focus right now in terms of cash and liquidity. The second most important thing which supply chain masters are right now investing in.
So thanks, Vivek. I think, like I said, please keep your questions coming on the email IDs that you see, and we will be very glad to hear your thoughts and answer your questions. We've 12 minutes over time, so thank you so much to everyone who attended this session. It was very exciting for us to share our thoughts, and glad to hear some of the questions that were there. And we hope to stay engaged post this session. So thank you very much. Thank you.